The area that is now Turkey has a rich and storied history, from the days of the Hittites and the depths of the Bronze Age to the ancient Greeks and Romans who ruled it for millennia. But of all these great empires and states, none truly reached the height of the Ottomans. With their capital in Constantinople, eventually Istanbul, they would reach heights unseen in the Western world since the days of Justinian, and no Muslim power since the Caliphate could match them. However, by the 17 and especially 1800s, they would struggle to compete with the rising European powers, and would suffer numerous conflicts with the Habsburg and Russian Empires. First, Egypt would break free in all but name, then the West would carve out nations from their Balkan provinces, further weakening the empire. By the eve of World War I, they had been reduced to Anatolia and Arabia, with their only European possession being eastern Thrace, and in joining that conflict, they signed their death certificate. Their defeat by the Entente nearly saw them carved up, only narrowly avoiding it through a war of independence. However, all of this begs the question, what if the Ottomans never declined? What if they remained a true great power, able to shape the world beyond their borders? Now, the thing about decade to century-long periods of stagnation and decline is that it can be difficult to pick a point of divergence. However, what we'll do is keep Selim III in power instead of him being deposed in 1807. Now, the path to this coup started with the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, a campaign that was motivated by his attempt to cut off British India, and this might delay his full seizure of power from the Directory, but ultimately it was a failure that didn't open a lasting front, so I think if we do just get rid of it, we can have history stay on track in Europe. However, the invasion directly led to Muhammad Ali taking power in Egypt, and the liberal revolutionary invading the empire, emboldening conservative elements against Selim III, who was increasingly enamored by Napoleon and bordering on pro-France despite relations with Britain. Selim III, however, had been making serious efforts to modernize the state, centralizing the bureaucracy, streamlining provincial government, even attacking the powerful institution of the Janissaries, slave soldiers that were given increasing rights and privileges in society and over the regular army. Selim attempted to replace this established force with what he called the New Order, which is admittedly an utterly terrifying name. However, when he attempted to base this group in Thrace, the Janissaries mutinied, a contributing factor to Selim being deposed a few short years later. Just by preventing the rise of French influence in the empire, we already do a good bit of the work. The reforms will look a lot more organic, and the Ottomans won't be dragged into an early war with Russia and Austria. But how do we prevent the mutiny and subsequent coup d'etat against Selim? To be honest, we do need to mess with Selim's personality a bit. He lacked a lot of hands-on experience with the European model he was trying so hard to emulate, which limited his success. But a bigger problem was that he just wasn't good at balancing court politics. According to Britannica, Selim attempted to have a lot of technical books and scientific theories written in Western languages rather than Turkish. It doesn't specify, but I'm assuming French and Greek, possibly Latin, which now that I think about it, might have been the start of written Turkish being Romanized by Ataturk about a century later. In addition, according to Konkaya University, Selim lost a lot of popularity because he lacked a centralized budget and paid for his projects with taxes on coffee and tobacco, while paying on a first-come, first-served basis, which isn't great for financial stability, if we're being honest. So what we'll do is have him not fuck with the language of the military establishment and academia, and push for a more centralized budget, or at least attempt to. This will take a lot of the wind out of the sails in the reactionary elements against the Sultan, while also helping stabilize the empire's finances. From there, the Janissaries will lose a lot of their funding, making it harder over the next several years to actually revolt. Of course, the empire won't be perfect, but this does immediately put them in a better economic and military position. And if the Janissaries do revolt, then now Selim is in position to actually crush them. We'll also say that during the chaos of such a revolt, that Selim's uncle Mustafa dies. He was the one the Janissaries propped up before his own deposing, so getting him out of the way is a good idea. Selim probably lives to about the mid-1810s, possibly the 1820s, but we can't know for sure. He was 47 at the time of the coup, so I think his mid to late 50s is fair for a king under a lot of pressure. Just a quick aside, since the Ottomans were only briefly involved in the French Revolutionary Wars, we're going to assume that those conflicts go ahead mostly on schedule. Frankly, the concert of Europe was half freaking out over Germany and half freaking out over the Balkans anyway, so messing with it would frankly be depriving ourselves of about half the scenario. As a result, Napoleon still does his thing until Russia does their thing. Now, the Ottomans still aren't without foreign problems, though. In our timeline, Selim was too pro-Napoleon and started a war against Russia due to the Battle of Austerlitz, convincing him that they were seriously weaker than he thought. As a result, he deposed pro-Russia governors in his Romanian vassal states, which combined with France's new Illyrian provinces to scare Russia. Does this war still happen? And if the new order is in a better shape militarily, what happens? Turning the war into an Ottoman win would likely have bigger butterflies for Europe than I want, but having them lose could discredit the reforms. In our timeline, it was a boon to the modernization efforts due to showing how weak the Ottomans had become, but that was after a coup halted these reforms. So, for now, I think we'll have the war be avoided. That means that Russia doesn't get Bessarabia, which will have consequences for a hypothetical Romania later. Now, in addition to that, we do need to consider two major minorities in the empire: the Greeks and the Egyptians. Egypt is probably the more egregious province from the Ottoman perspective. Despite the 1517 conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate, those same Mamluks had been allowed to persist as the local aristocracy. In effect, the province was more like a vassal state than a directly administered part of the empire. While this worked for a time, as the Ottoman state centralizes and the Sultan pushes for greater internal cohesion, I don't see it lasting long. In our timeline, it was destabilized by Napoleon and his invasion, which allowed for Muhammad Ali to take over the region and become the new Pasha. However, in this timeline, I think that Muhammad II, needing to test his reforms and with a much freer hand than in real life, would try to instigate a revolt and bring Egypt more in line with the other parts of the empire. This would be somewhere around the 1810s to 1820s mark, shortly off the heels of Selim's death. As a result, Mehmed II's reign will be spent largely dealing with the various minorities of the empire, including the newly integrated Egyptians. The Mamluk administration would likely be replaced by more meritocratic, Turkish and Egyptian rulers, like in other provinces, and answerable directly to the Sultan. At this point, a big question about the fate of the empire is education, because literacy is how you stabilize industry, bring about citizen government, and create complex and diverse economies, etc. You needed to invest in your country's future. And somewhat embarrassingly, the oldest actual statistic I could find is from 1910, when about 5.3% of the Ottoman population was enrolled in schooling. And this came from the US government for reasons? I genuinely don't know why Taft gave a shit about this. Though it was actually a congressional paper, so I guess it would be Joseph G. Cannon, who was apparently Speaker of the House at the time. Don't say I never teach you anything. Now, the problem here is obvious. We need to increase literacy heavily. Otherwise, the empire's economy will only stagnate. The earlier we do this, the better, but Mehmed is still only one man. In fact, the empire attempted to start such a system in the 1850s, but it was deeply flawed. According to Murphy Rhodes, in the imperial lineages in the Eastern Mediterranean, the early universities of the empire lacked a simple Turkish dictionary, requiring a French-Turkish one, and the book says that even those unable to read Turkish were admitted as full members. So, through some handwavium based on the French model, we'll say that the empire manages to develop some kind of education system by the 1840s that at least gets it to about 60% of the people being able to read in either Turkish or their regional language by the 1880s. This is still pretty far behind the other great powers, but it's leagues better than the real-life state of the empire. We'll touch on what that means for industry in a bit, though. Jumping back into politics and away from the nitty-gritty nerd stuff, the next big question is that of the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. The problem for the Ottomans here is that if they don't win near immediately, the other great powers will want to support the Greeks and pressure the Turks out. The Russians and Austrians due to their plans for the Balkans, despite their misgivings about nationalism conceptually, and Britain more or less due to being a bunch of weebs for the ancient Greeks. Now, the Independence War wound up turning into civil wars due to factionalism, which did allow the Ottomans to contain the worst of the revolts and only lose what is now southern Greece. So if we can stoke that factionalism even sooner, we can probably give the Ottomans a swift win against their subjects. Now, the question of ethnic minorities won't go away just because the empire's crushed a few other groups. See the entire history of Russia. That said, in our timeline, the Ottoman state did try to create a sense of nationalism under the idea of Ottomanism. Basically, the idea that all the ethnicities of the empire were to be equal before the law by the auspices of the Sultan and the empire. Now, this is difficult to make work and was embraced pretty late, but we might just be able to make a success story out of it. The empire was already more tolerant of Christians in the metropole than the Europeans were of Muslims in their core regions, after all. However, a major problem is that the notion was a reaction to Western nationalism and the ethnic unrest it caused in the Balkans. So really, it's still a backburner process for the first several decades. The alternative is to double down on assimilation and try to break up the minorities and their national consciousness by creating artificial division or messing with the demographics. Realistically, a stronger Ottoman state will likely dabble in both, and this will likely stoke a lot of religious and ethnic tensions among them. Now, going forward, the Ottomans are going to find themselves tied firmly to Britain and France diplomatically. Even if they are no longer in a steady decline compared to our timeline, Russia and Austria are still pretty open about wanting to dismantle the empire, and have been since, Catherine the Great of Russia. Coincidentally, who is in opposition to both of those powers? Britain and France, albeit mostly one against the other. Britain at this point was generally in splendid isolation, where they mostly fucked off to other parts of the world and beat them up for lunch money, and only bothered with Europe when someone forced their hand. Up until about the 1870s, that person was usually Russia. While France had some schemes, they were almost all failures, with Talleyrand and later Napoleon III constantly getting outplayed. Mostly Napoleon. The Franco-Ottoman alliance, aimed at Austria and sometimes Russia, was an on and off part of diplomacy for both powers, with Selim III being the last time they were true equals in that alliance. And even then, it didn't work out great for the Turks, as this video points out. From here, let's jump ahead to 1848. This is when we first start seeing the real big stuff. So, in our timeline, the Ottomans weren't hit too hard by the wave of protests, though Romania did see some reformist revolts that were ultimately crushed for the time being. But let's think of it this way. The Ottoman Empire is now a much more centralized state under the Sultan with a more modern government, but it has eroded traditional rights for its aristocracy, crushed minorities in Egypt and Greece, and begun demographic resettlement programs, while also, likely, developing a more meritocratic and civilian-based government. And if it's begun to see decent industrial growth, it would likely see a greater trend toward urbanization, which will stoke ethnic nationalism and even calls for a constitution. Which means that the unrest that caused the division of the Balkans and hurried the decline of the empire arrives about 20 years early. Except, this is a blessing in disguise. See, if the Ottoman Empire faces all these problems at the same time as the rest of Europe, that means that the West isn't able to exploit that chaos and division. So, in our timeline, the division of the Balkans was carried out by Otto von Bismarck in Prussia. At this time, he's dealing with the Frankfurt Parliament and all that chaos. But the big benefactors of the division were Austria and Russia, who are currently putting down the Hungarian Revolution, dealing with Italy, and sorting out the Polish uprising. Basically, I don't think there's any room for a conference to rip Bulgaria and Bosnia out of the empire. However, that does mean the empire now needs to sort out the whole militant revolution thing going on. However, in this timeline, they've got a much more modern bureaucracy and military structure, which will certainly help them deal with the rebels. Realistically, the biggest problem is likely going to be the Egyptians by sheer size or the Bosnians for distance, but for the sake of things, we'll say that neither of these groups rise up in serious revolt. However, the constitutional outcry will be a much bigger deal by the same token of urbanization and literacy, and this is much harder for the empire to just put down, since the military is a lot more likely to go along with these protests than the nationalist questions. Now, the Ottomans did have a constitution in the 1870s, but again, 20-year difference. The odds of it being comparable are slim to none. However, it does give us a workable precedent for the empire as a whole. Mehmed II died in 1839 of tuberculosis, but that's also a decently preventable death, so either he or his son Abdul Majid will be overseeing this 1840s constitutional era. Regardless, the 1870s constitution established a two-armed legislature and general freedom of religion, though the actual effectiveness of this constitution was limited as it faced continual challenges by the Sultan of the time. Even in this timeline, the Grand Council and Sultanate, as an institution, will be in a long power struggle. Before we get too deep into the rest of the 19th century, let's talk about industry. In addition to Arabia and Egypt having all the oil under the fucking sun, Anatolia and Greece do have a workable amount of coal, meaning that the empire can and absolutely will see industrial growth as its literacy improves and the government incentivizes a more Western credit-based finance system. Now, I don't think it will have the same staggering growth as the UK, Germany, or the US. Seriously, America was OP at the time, but it would certainly have an easier time in this scenario than, say, Russia. Depending on the politics of the Grand Council and the balance of power between them and the Sultan, the Ottomans might wind up a bit of a petrol state, exporting a lot of their oil and coal in a way that emboldens heavy industry while neglecting their lighter manufacturing, which could be a problem later down the line. Alright, let's talk about the Crimean War. Russia's expansionism will likely still lead to conflict between them and the Ottomans. However, in our timeline, both nations were falling behind, facing institutional rot, and neither really knew it. Not so in this timeline. This version of the Ottomans have a more or less state-of-the-art military, a much more centralized and cohesive institution to run it, and have begun a greater push towards industrialization. Now, Russia still has the sheer fucking size advantage, and this is the height of the empire's strength, but the Crimean War is also when they began to realize how woefully behind the West they've gotten, which now applies to the Ottomans, of all states. If I'm honest, that probably humiliates Russia more than losing to Japan did 50 years later, like, personally. The Crimean War didn't actually see that many territorial demands, just some minor lands in Romania, that Russia never gained in this world. In all likelihood, this just moves the toe concession to the Caucasus or across the Danubian Delta. However, it does reassert Ottoman claims to greatness, especially if we're able to minimize French and British involvement. Sorry for the quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and let's get right back to the show. Alright, so going forward is when things get messy. For example, why would the Ottomans give a Franco-British company the right to dig the Suez Canal when in this timeline they have a much firmer control over Egypt and the means to do it themselves? The short answer is they probably wouldn't, and the canal would be built by Ottoman money. However, this could have problems for their relationship with those same powers. But more immediately is the problem with Austria and Russia, because in our timeline both of these powers eclipsed the Ottomans pretty comfortably by the 1870s. While the Ottomans tried to reform, they were just too late, and if nothing else, Alexander II and his successors were very capable of bullying the nobility around to make their orders happen. Austria was more complicated, but there's a reason they were able to occupy Bosnia for ages and the Ottomans couldn't do anything when they eventually annexed it. But if the Ottomans beat on Russia and managed to reassert their credibility as a great power, then the incentive to reform explodes in both countries, while ironically going down in Turkey. While the Ottomans do likely continue their reforms due to professionalism problems and logistics strain on the Black Sea, if nothing else, the more they win, the more likely they grow complacent, which brings back a lot of the earlier problems. Austria is probably the one in the worst position after peace is restored. In all likelihood, they're unable to occupy the Romanian principalities, and it's probably obvious that both Russia and Turkey would kick their ass. Meaning that now Austria-Hungary, in addition to the problems with Italy and Prussia, has to deal with this and might actually start making genuine reform efforts. This has a whole array of consequences. I won't touch on an Austrian victory in the Brothers' War because I'm a YouTuber, meaning everything is a story for another time, and because I want to comprehend my own video. But Austria could absolutely wind up doing much better against Prussia, possibly keeping Saxony or Bavaria as buffer states between them and the new North German Confederation. This would in turn have consequences for the formation of Germany and World War I, but we'll get there in a moment. Probably. The Balkans as a whole would remain a serious problem for the Ottomans. While we're going to have them keep the region as best we can, I do think that Romania will be a flashpoint. Like we've discussed, the area of modern Romania was under two principalities that were vassals of the Ottoman Empire, rather than direct provinces. However, that autonomy could potentially result in another revolt, similar to the Egyptians earlier, or a repeat of the revolutions of 1848, where the Romanians were the biggest problem for the Turks in real life. They would likely demand political unification and possibly full independence, and I think they would receive support from the other great powers, at least Austria. This is probably the one unabashed loss that I'm going to have the Ottomans take during the 19th century, more or less to keep things interesting, I will admit. As a result, the other great powers call a conference and agree to allow Romania to unify under a German prince, more or less to create an Eastern Belgium between the Turks, Austrians, and Russians. Because one Belgium has worked well enough so far, right? Other Balkan problems, like Greece and especially the Slavs, will also be a continuing nuisance. In fact, the Ottomans were so aggressive with the Bulgarian revolt in the 1870s that it was considered the casus belli for the Russians to get involved again. This is where the idea of San Stefano, Bulgaria comes from, by the way. Basically, Russia used the opportunity to try for a really big Bulgarian client state, and everyone else said that it was too big and obviously just a way to get around the Bosphorus Strait. Which, to be fair to the other great powers, it was. So the problem here is that if Russia has reformed half successfully, which they probably do, then there likely appears the Ottomans again, meaning that the war is messy. This version of the 10th Russo-Ottoman War is likely a stalemate if it happens at all, and the Turkish reprisal on the Bulgarians is a lot harsher as a result. This likely alienates Britain and France, but it's hard to say to what degree, since objectively, the Ottomans are a lot more useful here than they were in our timeline. Turning to Africa, the Ottoman renewal is a very big deal here. See, despite it being the Berlin Conference, the British were the ones really calling the shots. They had the Cape of Good Hope and de facto controlled Egypt in the 1880s. You know what they don't control in this timeline, though? Egypt. It is as firmly an Ottoman province as Brittany is French, and they're not giving up on it. The result is that Britain can't force through a north-south corridor for their own colony, and that likely means the other Europeans are able to push for the east-west corridors they wanted. The most obvious of these would be Portugal's pink map. France might be able to take over Sudan if the Ottomans are compensated. While they don't own Sudan directly, they do control most of the Red Sea and parts of the Sudanese coast, meaning that a lot of its value to France would be under Ottoman control. Germany probably doesn't get Middle Africa, since the balance of power and the sheer audacity were a big part of why they were refused. So Belgium gets to commit their atrocities to their heart's desire. Britain probably just takes, like, the Horn of Africa and what was German East Africa in our timeline. They might push for a protectorate over Morocco, which could be interesting. Also, Italy doesn't get Libya, just while we're here. Regarding possible expansion for the Ottomans, the big targets will be the Balkans and Persia. They already have the Balkans more or less on lock, but they're going to need to defend against the Russians and Austrians. Persia, however, is different. A traditional rival of the Ottomans, Iran would now have fallen behind them, leaving them vulnerable. However, both Russia and Britain would have their own designs on Iran, and would want to prevent the Turks from fully subjugating the region, so as to maintain their own balance of power in the great game around Central Asia. As a result, I think that while some war in the 1860s to 1880s is likely, they wouldn't be able to carve too deep into the Iranian plateau, and Iran likely just winds up split 3 ways instead of 2, which is oddly similar to the Mughal video now that I think about it. Returning to Ottoman politics, we do have a bit of a precedent. While the first constitutional era was pretty brief, it was restored in 1908 and did have meaningful elections. The largest party was the Committee of Union and Progress, the cornerstone of the Young Turks movement. They were Ottomanist, as well as favoring centralization and secularism. However, they also tended toward Turkish imperialism in addition to the Ottomanist ideal, and were responsible for the genocides the empire carried out late in World War I, having embraced a lot of social Darwinist theories during their time driven underground by the end of constitutional rule. Their primary opposition was the Ottoman Liberty Party, which quickly became known as Freedom and Accord. They were in favor of decentralization and more in favor of the rights of minorities comparatively. In addition, there were a number of socialist or communist parties, not to mention the various minority rights-based parties that are inevitable when you have an empire this size. Now, since in this world the constitution wasn't suspended for decades, the CUP obviously doesn't go in that direction, but I think it's fair to say they remain the party of centralization and are generally more receptive to Turkish nationalism, while FNA will favor decentralization and minority rights. However, I think in this timeline, the power struggle between the Grand Vizier and the Sultanate would remain a problem. The Ottoman Empire would increasingly be dominated by industrial economics and labor questions, its military is multi-ethnic and professional, and citizenship is based on the law of the Constitution. However, the people are still very deeply spiritual, the very conceit of Ottomanist nationalism emphasizes the Osman dynasty, and the sultans were very keen to hold on to power. In addition, in our timeline, there were a series of coups and counter-coups by various factions regarding the Sultan, and even the Young Turks. In this world, who's to say that those haven't been stopped by the Sultan or the Grand Vizier at one point or another? As a result, the Ottomans could wind up a hybrid regime by the end of the 19th century. The Grand Council is very real, and it has teeth, but the Sultan isn't powerless either. So, here's the thing. We have no idea what World War I looks like in this world. The Balkans are firmly Ottoman territory, meaning that if anyone makes an untimely trip to Sarajevo, it's the Ottoman prince this time, not Franz Ferdinand. I would assume that some conflict would emerge at the start of the 20th century, just due to how the concert of Europe was constructed and the unraveling it's had since the Crimean War and German unification. Where the Ottomans fall in that struggle is hard to say. They have strong ties to France and Britain, but at the same time, they also hate Russia, who Germany promises to cut down to size. Given that in my Egypt videos I had them side with the Central Powers, I think I'll have the Turks join the Entente, or equivalent here. What this means for Austria-Hungary, I have no clue. Well, I do. It's bad. However, I'm not sure that the Ottomans would be too gung-ho to annex a lot of the territory, so in all likelihood they would just create a lot of client states. But in regards to the rest of the war, or who's pushed into what camp based on the Ottoman renewal, I don't think there's anything meaningful to say. Given the complete lack of ability to talk about the Great War at this point, I do think I need to end the scenario here. With Selim III keeping his throne and taking just the right lessons from the West, the Ottomans were set up for a much more successful 19th century. They've reined in the Egyptians, prevented the Balkans from breaking free and joining the Russian sphere, and have worked to rebuild a hegemony over the Middle East, becoming a true great power once again. However, the questions of the Great War remain uncertain, and whether or not they'll survive the 20th century is just as unclear. Before we go, thank you to channel members Daikami, Jadip Gill, Imagination, Nafumato, Grimwalt, and Dubs Main. And a special thank you to Grimswalt and Dubs Main for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.